Good day, my friends. In this country, we say good morning, or good evening, or good night. But when I lived in Newfoundland, the people there said good day any time of day. I say good day to you. What do you say? Good. Now that we're acquainted, I want you to know that I love young people. You see, I'm just a young fellow myself. Believe it or not. They tell me I was born November 28, 1889. They say I was there, but I can't quite remember it. Whether it was 1889 or 1891 or what, it matters very little. I am told that I am in my 94th year. Now this is part 3 in my talks about Mrs. E.G. White, her ministry, and the testimony of Jesus. If you did not hear parts 1 and 2, you should. They establish what the testimony of Jesus is. It's more than just a spirit of prophecy. Parts 1 and 2 of my talk on this subject are on cassette tapes. I'm a sort of a link between the early pioneers of the Seventh-day Adventist Church and the present generation. I have a special burden for our young people and for our new church members. They should know these things. First, I shall tell you about my first vivid memory of Mrs. E.G. White. My mother took me to camp meeting, as usual, in Michigan, when I was a boy. Mrs. White and Dr. J.H. Kellogg were the prominent speakers at camp meeting. I wonder if there's a girl here in the audience who is just 5 feet 3 inches tall. That is how tall or short Mrs. White was. She seemed to me, in my memory, as just like a dear grandma sort of person. Dr. J.H. Kellogg was not much taller than Mrs. White was, but he made up for his shortness in his bearing. He was very dignified. Now, in those days, people did not have mattresses like you and I have now. Some used feather beds, but most people had straw ticks. They were the same size as our bed mattresses. They were ticks filled with straw. The conference had a large tent filled with fresh straw, free for the taking. People brought their empty ticks with them to camp meeting and then filled them at the straw tent and made up their beds. And by the time the ticks were filled, the tent was nearly empty. Call porters then used that tent to live in for your charge. That particular year, my grandfather, Elder Luther Nathan Land, was in charge of the straw tent, and he was in charge of the call porters. So he couldn't live with the family in the Land tent. In that tent lived my grandma Land, Mary Land, her 2 daughters, Jenny and Eddie. They had trained to be Bible workers, Bible teachers, in Battle Creek College. Eddie was my mother. Just diagonally across the narrow alleyway, lived our dear friends in the Haskell tent, Elder and Mrs. S.N. Haskell and Mrs. E.G. White. That year, instead of having a 5 o'clock devotional service mornings in the great meeting tent, they had 2 or 3 tents assigned together in which their occupants had Bible study and the early morning prayer service. The 7 of us in the 2 tents met every morning in the Haskell tent. Before we could all get into one tent, we had to take some things out. Even then, 7 people in a family tent was a crowd. Every morning, we had to take some things out of the tent before we could get in. Every morning, I sat on a box beside my mother, who sat in a chair. And we sat right in front of Mrs. E.G. White, and I was so close to Mrs. White that once in a while our knees touched. But that was not embarrassing, because she seemed to me like one of my grandmas. She was a dear grandma sort of person. Now, if I had been a little younger, I probably would have been sitting on her lap. Since 3 of the ladies were Bible workers, Elder S.N. Haskell presided and asked the ladies to take turns giving a Bible study. One morning, when it was Sister Haskell's turn, she gave a study about Melchizedek, the priesthoods, and the Holy Spirit. It made a profound impression on my young mind. When she finished, Sister White commended Sister Haskell. But then she continued for some time longer with the same study. Sister Haskell, my mother Eddie, and my Aunt Jenny copied down word for word what Mrs. White had to say. Years went by. June 16, 1913, Ida C. Trout, a graduate nurse, became my wife in a wedding ceremony in the village church in South Lancaster, Massachusetts, and the Haskells were our guests. The next day, Ida and I were the guests of the Haskells in their home. While we were sitting there visiting, I asked them if they remembered that early morning meetings long before. They said indeed they did remember. Then they took us down to the office of their Bible training school. Sister Haskell drew from the safe the exact sheet of paper containing Sister Haskell's copy of the study that she gave that morning and the exact words that Sister White had used in adding to the study. I used that study many times in years following during my ministry. We lived in the Haskell house in South Lancaster when I was teaching in Atlantic Union Junior College. They told us that Mrs. White used to occupy the bedroom that was our bedroom when we lived in the Haskell house. And they said that Mrs. White had had many visions in that room. I tell you, it made us feel that we were in a sacred place to sleep in that room. Now, I'd like to tell you something about Mrs. White's voice. Many times I had heard remarks about the unusual carrying power Mrs. White's voice when she was speaking to large audiences. Some thought it was miraculous. Others thought it was because she had better knowledge than most public speakers about the proper use of the diaphragm and the vocal organs. Well, after I had become a young man, I decided to find out for my own satisfaction. One year I went alone to the Michigan camp meeting. Again, Sister White was the speaker at the Sabbath morning service. I first made my way slowly so as not to draw attention to myself and went to one end of the rostrum. At first I was bewildered. Sister White was speaking in a tone of voice as though she were talking to those right there on the rostrum with her. But no. As I turned and looked closely, she was standing at the pulpit, facing the audience in the tent and speaking not only to them, but to that throng of people out there in the field beyond the tent. I went to many different places around the great camp, through the campgrounds, among the family tents. Everywhere it was the same. I went to different family tents where mothers with babies couldn't get to the main tent and where some people were sick. And you know, in those family tents, we could understand clearly everything that Sister White said. It was marvelous. I wondered about that crowd of people who came out of the city through curiosity, standing out there in that field. So I went among them to hear what they were saying. And they were saying things like this. One said, "My, this is something wonderful. When the men talk, I can't understand hardly anything they say. But I understand every word that little woman is speaking. And she is not raising her voice at all." And someone else said, "I came out of curiosity. Someone told me that woman is a false prophet, but I don't believe it. That is not true. She isn't putting on airs like the false prophets do. You know what? She is speaking right to me personally. How does she know what my problems are? I'm so glad I came. The strange thing about it is, she's not straining her voice, but I understand every word she says." And another one remarked, "Say what you will. I am seeing and hearing a miracle. No woman could stand there and make us hear way out here in the field what she's saying. But she is doing it. That's a miracle. Men can't do it. I hear every word, and it's doing me good personally." Well, I went back to the big tent with the conviction that it was very unusual, if not a miracle. Men at that time had not yet invented public address systems. God had his own means of making his messenger's voice be understood to those people clear out in that field. I think it was miraculous. I am glad I decided to settle the question in my own mind. Now, I want you to remember a name. Merton Ashley. Let me hear you say it. Merton Ashley. Merton Ashley was born in North Dartmouth, June 26, 1856. And I checked that with the family records and with the church records, so I know it's correct. He remembered meetings that Captain Joseph Bates and Mrs. E.G. White held in what was known as the Adventist Hall in the city of New Bedford. At the time that he and Mrs. White were holding those meetings, he remembered a vision that she had in his father's home. His father and some others recorded that vision as Mrs. White related it and compared their recordings to make sure they were accurate. They watched the fulfillment of that vision year after year for many, many years, even to the years 1924 through 27. In 1927, Merton Ashley, who had faithfully kept his father's copy, let me copy what Mrs. White was shown in that vision. A few of the old members were still living, and they told me privately that the copy was absolutely accurate and that the story was accurate as follows. One morning at the breakfast table in the Jarvis Ashley home, Mrs. E.G. White said she could not eat until she told them about a vision she had just had during the night. And the different points of the vision were as follows. 1. She saw that the meetings that she and Captain Bates were then conducting would result in the organization of a Sabbath-keeping company of Adventists that would eventually become a strong church and for years would pay the largest per capita tithe of any Seventh-day Adventist church. That made her and the people to whom she told it very happy. And at the close of those meetings, they did organize a company of Sabbath-keeping Adventists. Number 2, some members would move away. Others would apostatize. Then scandals would rock the church. That made Sister White very sad. Number 3, the few members remaining would be unable to keep up the expenses of their church building and their operating expenses. In utter discouragement, they would sell the property to a furniture dealer for just enough money to pay off their obligations. Then he would use the building for a furniture warehouse. Terrible. God's house, desecrated and used for a warehouse. And then she saw that the few members remaining would finally be meeting in a dirty, rented hall. Number 4, she saw that the furniture dealer would then sue the church for damages, demanding his money back immediately and additional money to pay him back for extra expenses. And that made her and her hearers additionally sad. Number 5, she saw that 8 different Adventist ministers would try to hold meetings in that predominantly Catholic city, but they couldn't get anybody to come. Number 6, in her vision, she then saw a young minister go to New Bedford and the members would take new courage. They would pay that furniture dealer his money back again, plus his expenses, and leave him feeling very friendly toward the church. They would then buy additional property next to the church, more land, would enlarge the church building, modernize it completely. They would erect a church school building and successfully operate a church school. She saw evangelistic meetings then held with good success, and the church would be filled again with new members. Number 7, then she saw something very unusual that she could not understand. The church building would become something like a lighthouse. Flashes would go out from the church in every direction, great distances, carrying the 3 angels' messages. Well, how could that be? Would carry the truth to people who would probably never hear it in any other way. Well, this made her happy, and the people to whom she heard it rejoiced. But they couldn't understand. Invisible flashes. How could she see something invisible? But she knew that in vision, she saw invisible flashes. Number 8. Old members said that vision had been all that had kept them from giving up in despair, time and again. Year by year, for 3/4 of a century, they had watched the unfolding of that vision, except the end of it and about the invisible flashes. They wanted to live long enough to see what those invisible flashes could be. Now, Mrs. White was not an exclusive person. She was an extrovert. She loved people, and she especially loved young people and took an interest in their life. She was especially concerned for the youth. A young woman who had been a student in Battle Creek College had married. Her name was Eliza Annetta Lane, but most of people simply called her Eddie for short. Though she was very much younger than Mrs. White, she and Mrs. White were good friends. One day, Eddie and Mrs. White were taking a walk together in Battle Creek. Mrs. White was back on a visit to Battle Creek from her home in California. This, of course, was before she went to Australia. As they were walking along, pushing Eddie's baby in his baby carriage, Sister White stopped. She said, "Eddie, your baby is going to grow up and become an ordained Seventh-day Adventist minister." She put her hand on the baby's head, offered a short but beautiful prayer, and dedicated him to the ministry in his baby carriage. She did not tell Eddie anything more. If Sister White knew that God would use that particular baby many years later to fulfill the closing parts of that vision, she kept it to herself and did not tell Eddie. The baby was born many years after she had had that vision. The fulfillment of that vision would be unfolding year after year until between the years 1924 and 1927. Now, Satan tried by many means to prevent that baby from becoming a minister. He tried several times to kill him. He tried to involve him in a military career. He tried to so discourage him that he would end his own life. And after all those efforts failed, he tried to destroy the young man's faith when he became heir to more than $60 million, and all that that meant from the standpoint of the world. But the young man turned his back on that inheritance and started as a gospel minister with a wage of $15 per week and no subsidies. He never heard or knew about his dedication by Mrs. White in his baby carriage until many years after its fulfillment. Now, would you like to hear about the fulfillment of that vision? All right. As a result of those meetings, a company of Sabbath-keeping Adventists was organized, and it did grow into a Seventh-day Adventist church. And for many years, it did pay the largest per capita tithe of any Seventh-day Adventist church. During the years 1860 through 1863, Seventh-day Adventists became legally another denomination. But local companies were very, very slow. They were reticent to organize as churches. I am sorry that I am so hoarse, but I can't help it. I haven't recovered yet entirely from the flu and a bout with pneumonia. But I'm going to try to enunciate clearly so you can understand. I want you to know about the fulfillment of that vision. The company that Mrs. White and Joseph Bates had raised up finally decided to organize as a church in 1887. They declared a specially called legal meeting, and 17 of the companies signed a covenant to become a church. That was on March 24, 1887. And the meeting was under the direction of Elders J.B. Goodrich and A.D. Robinson, who had been sent from headquarters for that purpose. There were some questions to be cleared up that some did not understand, and so they adjourned while these matters were attended to. Now, the company up in Washington, New Hampshire was also desiring organization. So, during the interim, the two elders went up there. The company there completed organization, and Elders Goodrich and Robinson returned to New Bedford. The organization of the New Bedford Church was fully completed April 10, 1887. The company in New Bedford were the first to sign a covenant becoming a church, but while they were organizing, the company in Washington, New Hampshire completed organization first. So it can well be said that these churches were twin churches. Now, July 11, 1890, you see, that goes back to about the time I was born. The New Bedford Church people bought a lot on the corner of Willow and Bullock Streets. On that lot, they built a meeting house that was also to make history. There the church grew, and it paid the largest tithe, and then it declined. Some members did move away. Then, in that crisis that we speak of as the Alpha Deception, centered in Battle Creek, caused some of the members to apostatize. Serious scandals then did rock the congregation. The few members acting and remaining were unable to keep the church building in repair or even to pay operating expenses. They got in debt. In utter discouragement, they sold the church property to a furniture dealer by the name of Smith for just enough money to pay off their debts. For a time, they met in the Universalist church downtown, but then, Sabbath, they were meeting in a filthy, dirty, rented hall. New Bedford was strongly Roman Catholic. 8 different Seventh-day Adventist ministers were sent by the conference to hold public meetings in New Bedford with the hope of strengthening the New Bedford church again, but they couldn't get people to come. Mr. Smith, who had bought the church building, turned it into a furniture warehouse, just as Sister White was shown in vision 3/4 of a century before that. This seemed like Satan adding insult to injury. That year was 1924, when the tiny boy whom Sister White had dedicated to the ministry a half-century before in Battle Creek was then grown up. Regardless of all Satan had done to hinder him, he had been put in charge of the Friday night meetings in Cedar Lake Academy in 1907. That year he preached his first funeral sermon, and he preached every Friday night at the Academy. And thereafter he was regularly called on to preach in different churches. He became a nurse and a medical student and did medical missionary work. And then he became a teacher, and he married Ida C. Trout, a graduate nurse. And together they carried on self-supporting medical missionary work. After teaching in the junior college in South Lancaster, Massachusetts, they went to a large city for the specific purpose of raising up a church self-supporting. While serving as a supervisor in the City of Education, with a large salary and short hours in very pleasant work, he and his wife raised up 2 churches self-supporting and revived another Seventh-day Adventist church. And then they became deeply interested in New Bedford. In 1923, the Massachusetts Conference asked him to enter the ministry officially full-time with a salary of just $15 a week and no subsidies. That year, the Lord blessed his ministry with 2 more city churches, one on Martha's Vineyard and the other in Fall River. In 1924, the conference asked him to take over what was left of the New Bedford Church, making a district of 4 churches. He rented a house in Fair Haven, just across the river from New Bedford, and removed his family from the South Swansea to the New Bedford area. No sooner were they moved and settled when he received a legal notice as pastor of the New Bedford Church that the congregation was being sued for the money that Mr. Smith had paid for the church property and additional expenses totaling just $1,500. Well, that was a lot of money back there. The poor little congregation didn't even have 1,500 cents, let alone $1,500. Victor W. Smith, a furniture dealer, was suing the church because they had sold him the property without legal title. What in the world could they do? They were utterly discouraged And now, in addition, they were frightened. They were being sued. That was disgraceful. They felt terrible about it. So many things were happening so fast and at the same time that it is difficult for me to tell you the story. We shall have to leave that discouraged and frightened little group of people while we gather in the springs from several directions before you would understand all the circumstances. John Nickchild was on duty in the United States Navy during World War I. While he was away, his wife became a Seventh-day Adventist. Now, John was a calm and considerate man. He listened to his wife, and they had Bible studies. He became a Seventh-day Adventist. And then he became a colporteur evangelist. Right at that time, after World War I, there was a great immigration of Portuguese, mostly from the island of Madeira, off the coast of Portugal. Great numbers of those people settled around New Bedford and Falmouth. They didn't know any English, and John did not know any Portuguese. Now, some of them, of course, were learning to point their finger and say potatoes, or point their finger and say bread when they went to a market, but they couldn't carry on any conversation. John was selling a small book at that time. I think it had the title The Return of Jesus. Be that as it may, John would show the people the pictures in the book and let them read the headings in Portuguese, and then he'd take their orders, and he sold those books. My, how he did sell them. One Wednesday night, the young minister and his wife, Ida, went to a prayer meeting in New Bedford. They were living at that time in Brockton. John Nickchild and his wife, new Seventh-day Adventists, were there at that meeting. The meeting was held in the home of Tom Potter. There was a bit of concern that night in behalf of John Nickchild. He had received a letter from a Roman Catholic priest by the name of Manuel Nebrega asking John to meet him and a large number of men to whom he had sold books. They were to meet in a very light barber shop in Falmouth the next Sunday morning. He and his wife and the church members were pretty upset about it. They were afraid that it was a trap to get him there and maybe beat him up or do something to him. When John got there the next Monday morning, the priest was very friendly. He received John cordially. He and those men had been reading the books that he had sold, and they were just full of questions. The priest asked John to give them a Bible study on a certain subject, and when he was through with that, they asked for another one, and it continued until John had given them a study on practically every point of faith that we hold so dear. And then he was hoarse and just about exhausted at the end of the day. And John told the priest that he could speak no more. But he wanted to know something. Those men seemed to understand what he was talking about. And he had kept answering questions. It seemed mysterious to him. He didn't know any Portuguese, and they didn't know any English. And how was it that they had been so attentive? He thought in English and thought he was talking in English, but it was the priest telling him to be amazed. He said that John had been talking all day in the most perfect, eloquent Portuguese that he ever heard and he himself could talk eloquently in both Portuguese and English. As the priest turned to those men, every one of them nodded and agreed that they had understood everything that John had said that day in the language in which they had been born, and yet he had been thinking and thought he was speaking in English. Well, what was the result? The priest, Manuel Nobrega, and almost every one of the men present that day were later baptized and became Seventh-day Adventists. But going back now again to the young minister who was dedicated by Sister White in his baby carriage, when he held a tent effort in Fall River, and the elderly minister, E.E. Osborne, had been assigned to work with him, but Osborne's daughter in New York was stricken with polio, so the young preacher was left alone. The conference then assigned that ex-Roman Catholic priest to him to be his tent master. The conference brethren were pretty cautious about an ex-Roman Catholic priest being in our work. Soon after the tent meetings started, there was an English service every night at 7 o'clock, followed by a Portuguese service at 8 o'clock. When the church was organized, that ex-priest had as many converts as the pastor had. Nobrega was first ordained as a deacon, then as local elder of the new church. From Fall River, the tent and equipment was moved to Vineyard Haven on Martha's Vineyard for another tent meeting. John Nipchild was assigned to work with the young pastor, and Manuel Nobrega was to be their tent master. The conference brethren were still cautious about using an ex-priest, but the pastor had become fully assured that the priest was fully converted. The priest said that it wasn't his fault that he was in error, that his parents had dedicated him to the priesthood when he was born, and that as soon as he heard the truth, he accepted it, and now he wanted to preach it to his people. Well, as they talked things over, the pastor said to John Nipchild, "Let us just see what the Lord will do through Manuel. We have a budget of $3,000 for this tent effort. Let us put Nobrega over on South Falmouth and see what the Lord will do through him without 1 cent of budget." Well, John agreed. Within 6 weeks, Manuel Nobrega had 29 converts ready to be baptized in the ocean. Now, imagine being present at that baptism. One very large Portuguese man came into the water to be baptized, carrying a sizable package in one hand. The pastor asked Manuel Nobrega to hold the package while he baptized the man. Nobrega said, "You do not understand. This man is surrendering himself and all that he has to God. He went to the bank and drew out all his money and wants his money baptized with him." How wonderful it would be if all converts were as earnest as that. Now, while the baptism was in progress, an expensive automobile stopped beside the road, and a stranger got out and joined us. He was a wealthy Portuguese and a devout Roman Catholic. He told Nobrega that he had always wanted to be baptized like Jesus was. He wanted to be baptized right then and there. But Manuel Nebriga told him that he'd have to have some Bible studies first. Later, he was baptized. Manuel Nebriga's home was in New Bedford. He soon had a good number of converts in New Bedford. The pastor helped him organize them as a company of Sabbath-keeping Adventists. Now, we're ready to go back to that discouraged and frightened company of English-speaking Seventh-day Adventists in the North Dartmouth, New Bedford church. They were faced with that lawsuit by Mr. Smith, and they were not only discouraged, but they were frightened. What in the wide world were they going to do? Evaristo Nebriga, the uncle of Manuel Nebriga, the priest, was one of the new Portuguese converts. He offered the pastor $1,500 as a temporary loan to the New Bedford church without security until other arrangements could be made. Mr. Smith, the furniture dealer, was paid in full and left feeling very friendly toward the church. When the New Bedford church was organized, they elected a board of trustees to hold the church property in trust. Now we're going way back to the time they first organized as a church. The trustees at first were elected for a different number of years, so that one trustee retired each year and a new trustee had to be elected. Those members, being humble farmers and not conversant with real estate law, had neglected to elect new members, and more than that, every one of the original trustees were dead. And the church had sold the property as a congregation to Mr. Smith, and they had no title. The trustees had the title of the church, and they were all dead. Lawyers consulted, said no one could ever dispossess the congregation of their building, but they never would be able to sell the property to anyone. But the young pastor was not satisfied. He found that 8 of the old original charter members were still living. He called a legal meeting with those present and the 2 proxy votes of 2 members who were unable to come. They elected legally a new board of trustees. For a fee of just $100, he took a prepared constitution, as was required legally, and put the matter through the state land court and procured a title from the state that no one could ever question anytime, anywhere. And then the new board of trustees deeded the property to the Conference Legal Association to hold in trust. The pastor then went to the New Bedford 5-cent savings bank and procured a loan for $1,500 and paid Brother Evaristo Nebriga back again. So he had his $1,500 back. The members who had been so terribly discouraged and even frightened now breathed easier and rejoiced. And the arrangement at the bank was so reasonable that they could easily pay back that money in easy monthly payments. Well, indeed, it was refreshing at the next prayer meeting to hear their prayers and testimonies. How happy those few people were. Only 11 members. Many years had gone by. Not realizing the importance of keeping an accurate record of church events and membership in early days. It was difficult to reconstruct accurately a history of the earliest Sabbath-keeping companies. No records could be found of the organization or date when the New Bedford Church was organized. Neither was there any record of membership when the North Dartmouth and New Bedford churches were organized or later until the North Dartmouth church members, in the decline of their church, decided to join the New Bedford Church. No record of a vote of either church or the date when they were united together was found. They had their record when the New Bedford Church was organized, but not when the North Dartmouth Church was organized or when they united. In the New Bedford records, we found a statement that read as follows: the 20 remaining members of the North Dartmouth Church united with the 38 members of the New Bedford Church, but no date was given. The North Dartmouth members were very unwilling to give up their name or their church existence. So when the two united, they took the name, the North Dartmouth and New Bedford Church of Seventh-day Adventists. And so it was in 1924 when the writer became their pastor. When the English-speaking congregation in New Bedford and the New Portuguese Company of Seventh-day Adventists decided to join forces in redeeming the old property, they then took the name the English and Portuguese Church of Seventh-day Adventists. Harold N. Williams, Wilbur Armstrong, Mary B. Kilburn from the English division, and Manuel Nabriga and John A. Gomes from the Portuguese division signed the note at the New Bedford 5-cent savings bank with the privilege of making easy monthly payments. This the two divisions of the church could easily do. But there was the old building to repair and enlarge and modernize. The vacant lot next to the New Bedford Church was bought and paid for. All members of the church were wholeheartedly in support and cooperation with the pastor. Brethren Donald R. White, William Drew, and David Gardner were hired at a reasonable wage to assist the pastor. They excavated a full basement under the church and finished off modern classrooms and restrooms and enlarged the main building and put on a new roof on the church, put in a modern heating plant, modernized the building in every way. And a modern church school building was erected, and school started off with 28 children and 2 qualified teachers and a helper. To pastor the new churches in Fall River and Martha's Vineyard and an old one in Foxborough, and all this activity in New Bedford was burning the candle at both ends for the pastor. But he felt that if they were to retain the Lord's blessing, they must in addition carry on evangelism. First, however, if God was to bless that, they must have a clean church membership. Consulting the clerk's membership record book, he saw there were 26 members, but 13 of them had not attended a church service in 15 years. Some of them had dropped out during the trouble with Dr. J.H. Kellogg and his book about the living temple. This was before the Portuguese Company united with our church in New Bedford. We're going a step back again to clear some things up. The little group of faithful members had no church elder. Brother Wilbur Armstrong was serving as their leader. The pastor took Brother Armstrong with him and visited those 13 members Each one visited was very friendly. However, they didn't want to belong to any church. They gladly wrote letters resigning as members, and that left only 13 very discouraged members, and then 2 of them left and joined what was called the Reformed Seventh-day Adventist Church, leaving just 11 desperately discouraged church members. This was before Mr. Smith, the furniture dealer, had been paid. His lawsuit was then facing them. The pastor did not dare to ask those 11 people for money to hold a public effort, and he couldn't ask the conference to help after they had sent 8 men down there and they had failed. Well, if anything was to be done, it had to be done by faith. He had a tremendous burden for saving that church, which had seemed almost ready to die. How in the world could Mr. Smith be satisfied? Since 8 Adventist ministers had tried and failed, what could he do? Well, it took a lot of faith to do anything. He found that Oddfellows Hall, in the very center of the city, was the only place for public gatherings. He went to see the business manager. The business manager said with a sneer, "Oh, sure, I'll rent you the hall, but you waste your money. No one will come. Hasn't anyone ever told you that 8 of your preachers failed? What do you think a young fellow like you can do?" Well, the young pastor answered, "I can do very little, but the Lord can do things." And that made the man laugh with scorn. He said, "Hasn't anyone told you how this Catholic city broke the heart of the great evangelist Dwight L. Moody and ended his evangelistic career? What do you think you can do?" Again, the pastor answered humbly, "Well, I can do nothing, but the Lord can, and I want to rent this hall." He took the money out of his pocket and paid for the first Sunday night meeting. At first, the man refused to take it, but finally, shrugging his shoulders, said, "Well, I warned you, young fellow. You're wasting your money." Now, there was only one bench in that whole great big hall, and it could only seat 5 people. They had had a dance there before, and only one bench left. The pastor asked the agent where he could get more seats or benches. And with a sigh and a sneer, he said, "Oh, down in the basement, of course. Help yourself. But you won't get enough people here to fill that one bench." Well, the pastor went home. He looked around and found a small picture of some monkeys in a cage. And looking around some more, he found another picture of a Bible the same size. He cut them diagonally with his wife's scissors and put them together, pasted them on a piece of paper, and right over them in large letters put the words, "Does evolution monkey with the Bible?" And then he took that to the newspaper office, adding the time and the place of the meeting, and he paid for that little 4-inch ad out of his own pocket and went off to Martha's Vineyard for the Sabbath services, leaving Wilbur Armstrong to speak in the New Bedford Church. He made arrangements for Armstrong and some other men to meet him at 6 o'clock to get chairs up from the basement and get things ready for the meeting. He came back to New Bedford, and as he came near that hall, he was provoked. He was a bit angry. Why, there was a crowd of people standing in front of the hall, and he could see the entry full of people. Had that business agent up and rented that church to some other people, after he had paid for it? Maybe for a dance or some other popular thing? He was a bit vexed. When he got there, he had to elbow his way in, and he found that the people were there to find out if evolution did monkey with the Bible. God had brought the people. Well, there wasn't any use of waiting until 7 o'clock. He asked for some volunteers. One lady volunteered to play the piano, and they had a ringing song service singing old-time hymns that the people enjoyed. And then he delivered his message. Elder W.C. Moffat, the conference president, and Elder J.E. Edwards, the conference treasurer, had somehow learned about the meetings that were coming, but they thought that there were going to be cottage meetings in somebody's home. Well, they went to his home, and the pastor's wife directed them to the hall. They said afterward that it took them more than a half hour elbowing their way in before they were sure that they were even in the right place. God had brought the people. The offering, much more than paid for the rent of the hall and for the advertising. By the time the church building was ready, there were enough new church members to fill the church twice every Sabbath. There was an English service Sabbaths in the forenoon and a Portuguese service in the afternoon. One of the old sisters in the church died. Her will provided help when it was most needed. God answered the prayers. With what she gave and what the members had given, everything had been accomplished and paid for spot cash. There was no indebtedness. Things didn't work out just as well as planned. It had been agreed for the two churches to go 50-50 on expenses, but the Portuguese failed on their part. The pastor helped Manuel Nobrega to find another church property that was for sale, and the Portuguese bought that. The conference accepted Manuel, the ex-Roman Catholic priest, into the ministry, and the pastor had the happy privilege of taking part in his organization. Now, what about those invisible flashes that Sister White had seen in vision 3/4 of a century before, and a half century before she had dedicated that baby to the ministry? She in vision had seen those invisible flashes going out from the New Bedford church, carrying the three angels' messages to great distances to people who would probably never get it any other way. Well, Tom Potter had bought the old mayor's mansion in the very heart of the city. Now, not everyone would like to live in the heart of the city, but it was a bargain. It was a mansion. His wife, Agnes, was one of the faithful members and one of the officers in the New Bedford church. Prayer meetings Wednesday nights had been conducted there in that spacious parlor for years, before the church was ever redeemed back again. Sunday night meetings were still continued in Oddfellows Hall. Now, Pay particular attention to this. Every Sunday night, an exceptionally nice-looking gentleman, well-dressed, came to the meeting, got a chair, and instead of sitting with the congregation, he took that chair to the exit and sat down there. And he got away quickly every night after the benediction before the pastor could get to him. Who in the world could he be? Well, one day, the pastor's telephone rang, and a voice said, "Is this Pastor Williams?" "Yes." "Well, please meet me at the old mayor's mansion at once," and hung up. Well, what in the world could that be? Some kind of a joke or a happy surprise, or what could it be? But the pastor went, and he rang the bell. Sister Potter invited him in, and there stood the gentleman who had gotten away every Sunday night. Now, before telling you any more about what happened, I want you to know this. There was a self-styled Pastor Russell, years before that, who had founded the Millennial Dawn movement. Most of his followers were called Russellites. Later on, they took the name International Bible Students. Today, they call themselves Jehovah's Witnesses. Now, let us go back. The pastor was meeting this gentleman who got away every Sunday night. He introduced himself at once as owner and manager of radio station WNBH. He said, "I have attended every one of the meetings you've ever held in Oddfellows Hall. So have other prominent Roman Catholics, but not in their usual dress. I am a devout Roman Catholic. You have hurt the Catholic Church more than any other man who ever came to this city." Well, the pastor did not exactly tremble, but I can tell you he was a bit afraid. He didn't know what was going to happen next. Was the Catholic Church going to clamp down on him? Well, the man smiled, and he said, "I want your Sunday night lectures broadcast over my radio station. You are preaching God's truth in its purity. You do not throw mud or insults at anyone. You take everything right out of the Bible. You step on some people's toes, yes, but, they like it." The pastor replied, "Well, I have thought of that, but this is something entirely new. I've talked with quite a number of people. They're rather skeptical, reticent to think about religious services being broadcast over a radio station. I even went to your office and got the rates from your secretary. I found that it is $25 for only a half hour there in your studio. $50, it would be $50 for a half hour at Oddfellows Hall or any remote place, plus the expense of running wires and renting a microphone and all those things. So that would be over $100 a night, and we just couldn't possibly afford it. I thank you very much." Now, if you had been with Sister Potter listening and watching, you would have been interested, and this is what you would have heard. The radio man laughed and said, "Oh, you only think you can't afford it." And the pastor said very forcefully, "I know we can't afford it." Well, and they had that back and forth. "We can't afford it. You only think you can't afford it." And then the gentleman said, "Listen, please. I want to put remote control stations in Oddfellows Hall, in your church, and here in the old mayor's mansion. This means running wires to all three places. It has to be on an extended contract, for it is quite complicated and quite expensive to run all those wires and set up all that equipment. Now, what I want to do, Pastor, is this. I want to broadcast your Sunday night meetings, your Sabbath school and church service, Sabbaths, and he called it Sabbaths, and your Wednesday night meetings here in the old mayor's mansion. Instead of your buying microphones, as is customary, I have made arrangements for that and for the running of the lines. Now, please wait. Hear me out. The pastor tried to cut in, but he said, now wait. And he had some more to say, and then the pastor couldn't stand it any longer, and he threw up his hands. He thought the man was using high-powered salesmanship methods. He said, man, do you think I'm crazy or that I'm a millionaire? I tell you, we cannot afford to broadcast even one Sunday night meeting. He was getting a little bit wrought up. The man laughed good-naturedly at him and said, you only think you can't afford it. Now, please be patient and listen. The Russellites got on my station, and in their talk, they called the Pope a hog, and the priests pigs, and the sisters dreadful things. Even if I were a Protestant like you, I could not have such raw language going out over the air from my radio station. They are coming back tomorrow. They told my secretary that they're coming back tomorrow to sign a contract for a year for the use of the studio every Sunday morning. I want nothing to do with them. I'm not even going to meet them. But listen, I've been doing some figuring. I think the electric current would cost about $9 per week for what I have suggested. I have a contract right here, already drawn up, between radio station WNBH and Pastor Harold N. Williams. Now, all you have to do is to sign your John Henry on that dotted line right there, and you can have the whole thing for only $9 a week instead of over $500 a week. Now, my young friends, if you had been that young pastor, what would you have done? Tell me, please. Well, that is exactly what I did. I gave that gentleman $9 right there out of my own pocket and signed that contract right on that dotted line. And it never cost the church one red penny at any time. Now, different ones volunteered and helped in the programs, but that never cost the church any money. And the voluntary offerings coming in from the interested people who were listening to the radio more than paid the expenses. We used to receive as many as 150 letters from a broadcast. Every time I opened a letter, I looked at the signature first to see if I might know who wrote the letter. The first letter I opened one Monday morning was from 9 ladies. The Mother Superior from the nunnery in Fair Haven across the river and 8 of the nuns. Well, that surprised me. Among other things, she said, "Pastor Williams, you are preaching God's truth." I wanted others to hear it. There are 8 sisters whom I know I can really trust. I have a secret radio in my room. I get those 8 sisters in my room and lock the door, and we listen. We are praying for you. Now you must burn this letter at once. Being a Protestant, you would not understand this. We are under stern government here. If our Father Superior heard about this, it might cost us our lives. Well, I burned the letter, of course. The very next letter I opened was from their father confessor. Had he caught on to what they were doing? Well, listen. He was a very prominent and very much liked priest in New Bedford and the whole region around there. He intimated that he had been one of those who had attended my meetings in Oddfellows Hall. He regretted that he could not support my work openly and publicly, but he wanted to know that he was praying for me. He said, "You are preaching God's truth in its purity, and I am praying for you." Not being a Catholic clergyman, you would not understand my position, but if it were known what I am doing, it might endanger my life. Therefore, you must burn this letter at once. Well, of course, I burned that letter. But in his letter, he told me how to contact him, which I did. And I gave him Bible studies by correspondence until we went to Newfoundland in 1928. He accepted everything and was keeping the Sabbath when all at once I never heard from him again. I hope to meet him when Jesus comes. I wonder what happened. Was he afraid to answer again? Was someone catching on to what was going on? Did he fear he was under suspicion or what? You see, friends, radio does reach honest-hearted people who might never get the message in any other way. In a few weeks, the pastor's telephone rang again. Dear old brother Merton Ashley was on the line and asked me to come to the church at once. There I found him with tears running down his dear old face, but with a most happy smile. He was sitting in front of the pulpit, which Sister White and Joseph Bates had used when they raised up that company of Sabbath-keeping Adventists in New Bedford 3/4 of a century before that. Merton Ashley had something in his hand. It was the record that the family had kept for 3/4 of a century. It was the copy of what Sister White had told the people at the breakfast table that morning about her vision. It was the first time I had ever heard of that vision. He said he and others had watched the unfolding fulfillment of that vision for 3/4 of a century. At times they would have given up in despair had it not been for a steadily unfolding fulfillment and a desire to see the glorious ending and understand what those invisible flashes could be. They had wondered about that all those years. Those invisible flashes were radio waves. After Sister White had lived all those years, she died before she saw the complete fulfillment of that vision. That was the beginning of the Seventh-day Adventist radio. Now, friends, you're coming to the end of this tape.